In 1814, Comte de Montgaillard, as was to be expected of him, sang his recantation and insulted the idol which he had worshipped. I am not aware whether this appeal to the favor of Louis XVIII stood him in good stead with a prince whose faithless confidant he had been, and whom he afterwards branded by his revelations under the imperial government. Since I am speaking Monsieur de Montgaillard, I must say a few words about his brother's work. Monsieur de Montgaillard had a brother, an abbé, who was the author of a chronological abridgment of the history of France from 1787 to 1888. This book, every page of which is disfigured by injustice and errors, was no doubt written in one of those fits of depression to which its author was subject. It seems to have served him alone as a means to pour out the most vehement invectives on Napoleon and on the most honored names of the empire. The chronological abridgment does not justify its title. The author, instead of giving a concise statement of the principal occurrences, is careful to omit all events which do not afford him the opportunity of venting his spleen in sour and interminable diatribes on Napoleon and his acts. Although very incomplete, this book won for its author a letter of congratulation from General Foy, who was pleased with the facilities which books of this kind afford to the student of history, rather than disgusted at the spirit in which it was written. A voluminous history of France was published after the abbé's death under his name. The history, which is a prolix amplification of the chronological review of the history of France by the same author, is the work of his brother. The abbé would not have accepted the Comte de Montgaillard as his collaborator, for it was his habit to answer anybody who asked him for news of his brother. That is a question which I have refused to answer for the last 30 years. Another publication which I may mention here, although it only appeared 2 years later, is that to say, in 1806, contained certain revelations on the part which the princes, notably the Comte d'Artois, had played in our civil wars. It is entitled Historical Memoirs to Serve for the History of the Vendée War. The author, Comte de Vauban, great-grandnephew of the Marshal de Vauban, had followed the Comte d'Artois to St. Petersburg as his aide-de-camp when this prince went to solicit the help of the Empress Catherine in favor of the Bourbons. Monsieur de Vauban, on his return from this journey after had taken part in the expedition to Quiberon, went to join his prince at the Ile-Dieu. Then, discouraged at last by the sight of the futilities and the meanness of which he had been the witness, he took advantage of the amnesty to return to France. Falling under suspicion of the police, he was imprisoned in the Temple, and it was in this prison that he wrote his memoirs. He filled them with all the bitterest recollections, and with revelations which were in no way favorable to the party which he had served. The government, having seized these memoirs, thought it advisable to profit by this discovery, and had them published with the author's name. The discovery of the existence of the royalist conspiracy and the confessions of some of the assassins arrested in Paris acquainted the first consul with the fact that the Duc d'Enghien was living at Ettenheim, that Dumouriez had been sent there, and that he was probably there still. He came to the conclusion that this place was the center of various ramifications of the conspiracy. Before relating the circumstances of the forcible seizure and trial of the unfortunate Duc d'Enghien, I must further go back in history. I had no desire to recall these sad memories, which have given rise to so many erroneous judgments. But it seems to me to be my duty to render strict justice to the memory of Napoleon, and I believe myself to be acting in obedience to one of his most pressing recommendations in relating what is my personal knowledge of an affair which party spirit has so strangely transformed. The occurrence itself is today appreciated at its just value, provoked by the English government. The death of the last of the Condés has brought forth deplorable fruit. The principal interest attaching to this occurrence is due to the influence which it had on Napoleon's political career, and it is on this account that it occupies so important a place in the history of our times. I propose, therefore, to give the principal outlines of this story so that the impartial reader, from a consideration of them as a whole, may form an opinion on an act of severity to which Napoleon was impelled by a combination of fatal circumstances and an inflexible interpretation of his duties, as the head of the government, an act of which this great man accepted the responsibility with the lofty frankness and the pride of his character, and which, as he himself has confessed, was prejudicial rather than useful to his glory. The English government, which had at first affected to consider the plan of an invasion of England with contempt, rightly alarmed by the formidable armament which was being prepared in sight of the shores of England, had ended by attaching such great importance to this expedition that on its side it made the most extraordinary preparations against it. Redoubts and entrenchments were multiplied on the southern coast of England. Works for inundating the surroundings were carried out. The ministers themselves and the principal members of the aristocracy had assumed military uniform and figured in the ranks of the volunteers. And every man able to carry arms had been called out and was being drilled. The general anxiety was excited and kept alive by a succession of alerts and panics, which carried dismay into the hearts of London itself. A large number of families removed from the neighborhood of the seaboard and took refuge in the interior of the country. And whilst the government was doing all its power to avert the storm, it strove to prevent its bursting on British territory. All the resources of the most cunning diplomacy were called into play, and gold was scattered broadcast to induce the powers to declare themselves and to engage on the continent the enemy which threatened England. Not considering these means insufficient, it had recourse to conspiracies. At the commencement of 1804, the French princes, who had retired to London, planned a serious attack on the person of the head of the consular government, and were favored in this by the English ministers. An order of the King's Privy Council enjoined on the French exiles to betake themselves to the banks of the Rhine, and this under penalty of forfeiting their pensions. And a regulation fixed the amount of pay to be allotted to each officer and each soldier. The Duc d'Enghien had previously obtained permission from the Elector of Baden to establish himself at Ettenheim, a small town situated on the right bank of the Rhine, and at a distance of 2 leagues from this river. At the very time when the exiles, acting under the order of the Privy Council, were assembling on the frontiers of Alsace, some determined royalists who had fled to London after the pacification of the Vendée, and who were commanded by the former Chouan chiefs, secretly landed on the Dieppe coast and made their way to Paris by roundabout routes, finding shelter in their way in isolated farms and cottages where they were received by peasants who had been won over to their cause. George Cadoudal, Rivière, aide-de-camp to the Comte d'Artois, the brothers Polignac, Pichegru, and 50 other conspirators, and in this way secretly arrived in Paris, where they were hiding in places unknown to the police. The agents of the French police in London reported that some great conspiracy against France was being prepared. The report that the consular government was drawing to a close, that the days of its head were numbered, and that the former reigning family were about to reascend the throne was generally spread over England and Europe, and indeed had even reached our colonies. A pamphlet entitled "To Kill is Not to Murder," which had originally been written against Cromwell, was reprinted in London in allusion to the first consul. A newspaper, L'Ambigu, written by French exiles, appeared with a portrait of Bonaparte with a black mark around his neck. At the head of its columns, advices received from various sides announced that bodies of exiles would shortly land in the Vendée. The news which the first consul received from the district induced him to send one of his aides-de-camp, Colonel Savary, to the Vendée. His report confirmed the consul's suspicions as to the masked allegation which existed there. The first consul remembered that there were, in the prisons of Paris, a number of persons who had been arrested on the charge of having been sent from London for the purpose of attempting his life. Their arrest on the seaboard, in the very act of espionage and corruption, would have sufficiently justified their being tried by court-martial. But as they had been accused of contriving to murder the head of the state, They had been detained in prison pending the establishment of this charge. The first consul ordered that some of these persons should be brought before a court-martial, hoping to obtain some revelations as to the object of their journey from some of them. 2 were tried and sentenced. The fear of death did not cause them to waver, and they died threatening the government with an approaching catastrophe. The reports of Monsieur Méneval de la Touche and of Captain de Rosy, whose mission I have related, have revealed the plots which were being hatched on the right bank of the Rhine by the English ambassadors accredited to the courts of Munich, Stuttgart, and Kassel. The first consul, whose mind was made up as to the imminence of the danger which threatened the state and his own person, but still to some extent in the dark, had the list of arrested Chouans once more laid before him. The entry in the jail book concerning one of these Chouans, who was known to have acted either as servant or as a confidant to George during the last insurrection in the West, gave rise to the suspicion that he might know something of the matter. Querelle was tried and sentenced without making any confession, but on the night preceding his execution, the fear of death prompted him to speak. He related that he had been in Paris 6 months, that he had come there with George and 6 other conspirators, whom he named, that they had been joined shortly after their arrival by 15 others, that more were expected to land, and that Paris was the meeting place generally agreed upon. Querelle's declarations, which were rewarded with a pardon, put the authorities on the trace of some important discoveries, leading up to a former emissary of the party, a man called Trochet, who was a clockmaker at Eu. The first consul sent his aide-de-camp Savary, accompanied by the clockmaker's son, who took the place of his father, who was a very old man, to Dieppe, where a fresh landing of exiles was expected. Colonel Savary, in company with young Trochet, on arriving at Dieppe, set out at once for Belleville, where the landing was to take place. Owing, however, to bad weather, which lasted several days, and to the fact that in the meanwhile, on information transmitted from Paris, signals had been made to the brig, which cruised for several days in front of the cliffs of Belleville. The expected landing, which is said would have included the Duc de Berry, and it did not take place. In the meanwhile, the police, under the direction of the Councillor of State, Rial, taking advantage of Querelle's revelations, had made active investigations which had put them on the trace of persons in hiding in Paris. The arrest of George and of accomplices, which rapidly followed, led to the knowledge of the different parts played in the conspiracy by Pichegru and Moreau. George had declared in one of his examinations that he awaited the arrival of a French Prince of Paris before acting. As new revelations arose, the importance of the conspiracy and its various ramifications were brought to light. From the extent of these ramifications, the magnitude of the danger which menaced the state and the person of the first consul can be judged. The intrigues of the English diplomatic agents, which were plotted on our frontiers and which extended even to Paris, proved the active cooperation of England, whose government was the soul of the coalitions. The presence of George proved that murder was intended. The name of Moreau was a call to insurrection in the army, and a prince of the House of Bourbon was to put himself at the head of the conspiracy and give the signal for its outbreak. Amongst other information which was obtained was a detail which attracted attention in the highest degree. A person who was known to George's gang had had interviews with the latter. He had been received not only by George, but by Messieurs Polignac and de Rivière with particular marks of deference. This naturally gave rise to the thought, and this would have been the case even if George had not declared the fact, that so important a conspiracy must necessarily be under the command of a superior chief, either present or not far distant, invested with the extraordinary powers, who could make himself known as soon as the enemy had been struck down. It was concluded from this that the person received by George must be this head, and that he was one of the princes of the former royal family. The various members of the royal family were passed in muster. It was known where the Comte de Lille, Louis XVIII, the Comte d'Artois, Dukes de Angoulême and Berry, and Prince de Condé, the Duc de Bourbon, the Prince of Orleans, the latter living peacefully away from all centers of intrigue, were to be found. There remained only the Duc d'Enghien, of whose very existence Napoleon was almost ignorant. The belief was entertained that this prince might well be the mysterious person of whom we have already spoken, although the description which had been made of him only tallied in a very imperfect way with that of the Duke. The most striking differences in the description of a man who was totally unknown in Paris could not put a stop to the conjectures of which he was the object. The presence of the Duke d'Enghien on the banks of the Rhine, his communications with the exiles who were assembling there, the participation of the English government in the conspiracy, the fact of which was established by all the informations collected by the police, the absences of the prince on alleged hunting expeditions, his excursions on the Rhine, the suspicion that he was in the habit of going to Strasbourg, gave new strength to the presumptions already existing that he was the chief whose name and rank placed him at the head of the conspiracy. Suppositions excited by suspicion are of rapid growth. It was consequently assumed without hesitation that the Duc d'Enghien might have come to Paris and stayed there and have returned to Ettenheim within the space of 8 days. So vivid was the conjecture that the principal houses in the Faubourg Saint-Germain were searched to see whether the prince was not hiding there and whether no secret preparations were being made to receive him. It was even supposed that he might have found shelter in the house of the Austrian ambassador. The report to the effect that Dumouriez, the maker of civil wars and the most active and experienced agent of conspiracies, was at Ettenheim, as was the prince's advisor, changed suspicion into practical assurance. Instructions were sent to Monsieur Shea, at that time prefect of the Lower Rhine department. The report which sent back changed suspicion into certainty. The first consul had more confidence in his own presentiments and foresight than in the judgment of the police, which, since its suppression as a special department, was lacking in the cohesion and impotence so necessary under the extraordinary circumstances which had arisen. On rising one day, he ordered General Moncey, first officer of the gendarmerie, in a confidential way to send an intelligent officer under disguise to Ettenheim, with orders to find out all that was going on there, and to make a list of the people of every rank who were in relations with the Duc d'Enghien. General Moncey handed the report of the officer whom he had entrusted with this mission direct to the first consul, without showing it to the police. Amongst the names of the Duke's friends mentioned in this report were those of Dumouriez and of an English colonel named Smith. It was only later that it was known that the general whom the author of the report had taken for Dumouriez was General Tuileries, whose name was mispronounced in German, and that the English Colonel Smith was a simple German captain named Schmidt, who belonged to the prince's staff. This report confirmed the first consul in the opinion that the Duc d'Enghien presided over the company of which Paris was the headquarters. The presence of Dumouriez seemed especially a decisive proof. This general, in his opinion, must be the pivot of the whole conspiracy. Napoleon was at that time in ignorance of what Dumouriez might be with the various princes of the former dynasty. His presence at Ettenheim was considered sufficient. He was persuaded that the arrest of this person and the seizure of his papers would supply exact information on the organization and the means at the disposal of the conspiracy.